You're watching a special Hot Indonesia with Sandrina, Millie, and me. Bahasa Indonesia, the language of Indonesia, is a beautiful language that keeps the world's biggest archipelago together. Among its supporters is a former Jakarta Post editor living back in England who hasn't stopped using or promoting it. English is considered the international language of business, but there are those who believe Indonesian could take its place as an alternative, or at least in the ASEAN region. Supporters point to its relatively easy pronunciation and structure and familiarity in other countries, including Malaysia and Australia. Bruce Emond is a former Indonesian resident, now living in Canterbury in the United Kingdom. He spent a total of 26 years here in Indonesia, most as a journalist. Bruce, welcome. Good to see you again. Now, while living here, you embraced the language and culture, kind of a role model for me. You continue to study Bahasa Indonesia there. What is the root of your affection?
Well, I think the root for me, Dalton, is the fact that Indonesian is kind of like the melting pot of so many different languages, right? So my father was South African. I could mention different words like in Indonesian, ember. My father knew it, right, from South African, from Dutch. So I think with Indonesian, you get to see so many different aspects of the world. I talk with my Portuguese friend. There's so many words, bonica, even the word tolol, which comes from Portuguese, garpu. I talk with people from different nations, so you can actually trace the history of Indonesia and also the world through Bahasa Indonesia. I think actually it's very similar to the cuisine of Indonesia. You see the different elements, and to me that's a beautiful thing. And in fact, coming back to England, I've taken 2 classes on Bahasa Indonesia that have kind of seeing different people from different countries who are interested in Bahasa Indonesia, and then also hearing the plan to make Bahasa Indonesia the language of communication for ASEAN, which I think is a brilliant thing. And actually something that Millie said last week was very interesting to me about the pride that Indonesians today have about their culture, right? Which is, for a long time, we thought that Indonesians kind of looked at Bahasa Indonesia or, Indonesian food, well, they don't like to promote it so much, right? They have a lot of pride when people take an interest in it. So for me, looking at it, like you said, 26 years, first time when I was 17 in Padang, when I was a high school exchange student, I love the fact that I could learn Bahasa Indonesia, that I could speak it, that if I went to Gorontalo, if I went to Sulawesi, if I went to, a small island like Rote in the eastern part of Indonesia, we could all communicate in the same language. And that to me is the beauty of it, that unity and diversity.
Okay. Sandrina, question for Bruce?
Bruce, in the olden days, the internationalization of a language is usually related to colonialism. The invasion and conquering of a colony gives birth to the use of the invader's language. This was how English, French, Spanish, and Portuguese, just to name a few, became the new language in the international community and became a communication tool used amongst different countries. Now, lately, this theory has been revised. Colonialism is no longer seen as the important variable, but it is the domestic economic scale and international trade strength of that country. This is why we've seen lately Mandarin has gained such popularity. So, in your opinion, Bruce, does Indonesia have the potential to become such a strong and important global economy that would widespread the use of Indonesian language, making Bahasa Indonesia one of the main languages used at least in Southeast Asia or even the world?
Oh, I certainly do, Sandrine. I mean, you look Indonesian, okay, you find it in Malaysia, of course, but Tagalog, it has many of the ako, sakit, many of the same words that we have, the basic words. And I think if you use ASEAN as the launching pad, certainly as a form of communication, Indonesian can be simple, but it's not simplistic, right? It's not going to overtake French or English as a language of diplomacy, but certainly in ASEAN, I think it should be. And I'm always interested in seeing that other students who are taking part in the Bahasa Indonesia classes that I take here from the Indonesian Embassy or from SOAS, from all over the world interested in Indonesian, fascinated by Indonesian. And you're having a lot of standardization of Bahasa Indonesia in the last few years. And that's a brilliant thing, right? To make it a formal language that people can communicate in, right? And not just dismiss it as, oh, bahasa pasar, the language of the market.
Yeah, and you know what? I'm having a cup of Java, which is a slang, which originated here. And one more point, I think Bahasa Indonesia is a lot easier to learn than Mandarin. I mean, that's a given. I think nobody will dispute that. Okay, Millie, question for Bruce.
Well, Bruce, you know Bahasa Indonesia Baku, or the standard Bahasa Indonesia, nobody is using it. You know, only politicians maybe, because it's too kaku and too rigid. So being so rigid, we Indonesians used to add slangs, you know, and we even mix it with English. So is there any chance for this type of Bahasa Indonesia to go out globally, you think?
Well, I think that's a very good point, Millie. I think that's kind of the beauty of Indonesian, that wordplay that Indonesians have, right? The mixing of slang and it's actually quite hilarious, right? Once you've got into it. I think that's that's something that comes with learning the language, living with Indonesians, and that's another step in the process, right? I think a lot of people find that difficult if they've studied Bahasa Indonesia formally, and then you go to Indonesia and people aren't saying apakah itu, they're not saying in that formal way that used to be taught. But everything's changing, Millie.
There are 700 indigenous local dialects in this country, with Bahasa Indonesia the common thread.